Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you here today, but also those of you who are following this through the live stream. And welcome to this event organized on the occasion of the Dutch translation in 2023 of the novel Niki by Christos Chomenidis. My name is Maria Bolletsi. I'm endowed professor in modern Greek studies and the holder of the Marilena Laskaridis chair at the University of Amsterdam. And I also work as associate professor in literary studies at Leiden University. And we've put together this event together with Hero Hokverda, who is sitting here in the front row, and who is a translator of Niki in Dutch, and also the most prolific and well-known translator of modern Greek literature in Dutch, and to whom we owe virtually countless translations of prose and poetry from Greece and Cyprus. We have the pleasure of having with us today three speakers. The author of Niki, of course, Christos Chomenidis. Elke Weesjes, who flew all the way from New York to be with us today, and Michel Krielaars, who will also act as a moderator of the discussion later on. And I will introduce all three of them in a bit. Before I say a few words about the topic of the event tonight and our speakers, I'll take a moment to thank those who contributed to the realization of this event by supporting and sponsoring it. And those are the Humanities Faculty of the University of Amsterdam, the Dutch Society for Modern Greek Studies, the NGNS, the Modern Greek Studies program at the UFA, and the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation, who sponsors the Marilena Laskaridis chair at this university, Prometheus Publishing House, which is the novel's Dutch publisher, and the Embassy of Greece, who also supported this event and placed it under its aegis. We're also very grateful, of course, to the SPOW25 team for the excellent organization, and Jetke Brouwer particularly, who coordinated the event at SPOW25 from the start, and obviously also our wonderful panelists. Now, I'll say a few things about the topic today, but also about the novel itself, which is at the center also of this event, and the context of the novel, to frame the discussion a little bit, because we cannot assume, of course, that all of you are either have read the novel or are familiar also with the historical context in Greece at the time. Niki was published in Greek in 2014 and has been translated in many languages. In 2021, it won the European Book Award for the French translation, the Prix du Livre Européen. And this year it was also longlisted for the European Book Award here in the Netherlands. And it's actually the first novel of Chomenidis that is translated in Dutch. Let me move on a little bit to Niki, the novel and its and the history around it. And you're about to get a crash course in Greek history. Sorry about that, I'll be brief. So in the PowerPoint, we've put together this kind of timeline of important events within the novel in yellow, and historical events or developments in white that play an important role in the novel. So the novel is a chronicle of sorts, mixing fiction with history and also autobiography, as it tells the story of Chomenidis' own mother, Niki, and that of her wider family, extending to her parents and grandparents. This family forms a kind of microcosm that introduces us to the intricacies of 3 decades of Greek history, basically roughly from the 1920s to the 1950s, but also parts of that history that preceded the 20s through the stories of Niki's grandparents and her parents, which almost take up half of the novel. Through these family stories, we enter, for example, the historical chapter of the expulsion of Greeks and Christian populations from Asia Minor during the Greco-Turkish population exchange in 1923, the harsh conditions of their integration in mainland Greece, and the ambivalent and often hostile attitudes that these refugees from Asia Minor faced in Greece by the mainland Greeks, the Eladites, as they called themselves, who saw these refugees as Turkish breed, disparagingly calling them Turkosporus, Turkish breed. Then also the Greek-Italian War of 1940-41 between Mussolini's Italy and Greece, which was then under the dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas. Then the German occupation from 1941 to 44 and the Greek resistance, in which the left-wing movement of EAM, it's the National Liberation Front, and its military arm, ELAS, the Greek People's Liberation Army, took the lead, forming actually one of the strongest resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe. Now, after Greece's liberation, EAM came to control most of the country until it suffered a great military defeat from the government forces with the British in the so-called December events, the Kemvriana, leading to the forced disarmament of its military arm and a widespread prosecution of its members that eventually kind of led to the full-blown Greek civil war from 1946 to 49. Now, this bloody civil war between communists and let's say the established government was a particularly violent and traumatic chapter of Greek history that is lesser known than, for example, the Nazi occupation or the resistance. And Chomenidis, in his novel, boldly chooses to delve into the complexities of this historical chapter through the story of Niki and those around her. Like I said, almost half the book concerns Niki's grandparents and parents and their different paths that they followed before they arrived in Athens. The story of Niki's parents, Antonis and Anna, who fell in love not just with each other, but also with the communist ideal and became involved with the Greek Communist Party. And then Niki's father, Antonis Armau, climbs to the top of the party and becomes a member of parliament, but is afterwards imprisoned for political reasons. And Niki passes, as a child, as an infant, he passes her first years with her exiled mother on different Greek islands. Then Second World War breaks out. She's sent to live in Athens with her grandmother and her uncles and aunts, who do not really share her parents' communist allegiances. So she's exposed to another very different context. And in fact, Antonis' sisters are married to men in high positions. One of them is actually becomes minister in the government put in place by the German occupier, so on the side of the collaborators in a way. So when Niki is reunited with her parents at the end of the Nazi occupation, she has trouble adjusting to her parents' communist values. There is a fantastic scene in the novel where her mother asks her to donate, to give away her dolls, except for one, to the poorer classmates, and Niki finds that really, really difficult to do. Now, after the occupation and in the midst of the civil war in 48, the family learns that Antonis Armaus, the father, is about to be arrested and executed, so they go into hiding within the city, in Athens, in a house in the city, under dire conditions. Niki is 10 years old, and they will stay in hiding for 7 whole years. So these are very formative years, of course, in a child's life, from 10 to 17. And then in 1955, when this hiding stops, Niki is finally sort of free to live her life, begins working as a waitress in a high-end restaurant, meets somebody she falls in love with, and so on and so forth. I will not talk about the ending because I don't want to have any spoilers if you haven't read it. And what I hope becomes clear from this brief account is that at the center of Niki's story, or an important part of it, are questions of ideological, and in this case, communist upbringing, and the kind of effect that this has on the experience, on the way that a child experiences the world. And our discussion today will also center around this topic. For example, what were the effects of communist upbringing for children? How did communist upbringing take shape in countries beyond the Eastern Bloc, so like Greece, but also the Netherlands, in which a communist state was never a reality? how the children growing up in communist families negotiated this relation between two worlds, inside and outside the family. What parallels could we trace between Niki's upbringing and other forms of ideological education, like religious education, for example, in Greece and in the Netherlands? And how does the novel mediate this relation between personal stories and history, or between the family and the nation in this period of Greece's history? And finally, also, why should we talk about this today? So what are the afterlives, the resonance of these histories and of communist forms of upbringing or other forms of ideological upbringing in the present, 25 years after the fall of Eastern Bloc communism and in the era of global capitalism? So three speakers will respond to this and other questions from their own perspectives and expertise. Let me briefly introduce them before I give them the word. Christos Chomenidis, the author of Niki, a very prominent Greek author who published his first, let me move to the next slide, it's kind of a collage of some of the covers from books of all the three speakers. So Christos Chomenidis started his career as a literary author with his first novel, The Wise Child, το σοφό παιδί, in 1993. He's a very celebrated author in Greece and internationally. His novels have been translated in many languages, including French, English, Lithuanian, Polish, Turkish, Hebrew, and now also Dutch. Just to mention a couple of titles from his novels, Ο κόσμος στα μέτρα του, The World Tailored for Him from 2012, Νεαρό άσπρο ελάφι, Young White Deer from 2016, and another novel that I particularly like myself, also Phoenikas, The Phoenix from 2018, which is a very ambitious novel. Well, just like Niki here, fiction and reality get entangled with a host of historical figures, poets and artists kind of parading through its pages and covering a span of 70 years, actually, from 1860 to 27. So maybe a next translation project for Hero. Chomenidis' work has attracted a lot of public attention and prizes. A lot has been written about it and about Niki particularly, also in the Netherlands. This month there was the new issue of Lichnari, the Dutch magazine on Greece, published an extensive article on the novel and on Chomenidis, for example. And in case any of you are interested in discovering what has been written about Chomenidis and his work in English, there is this wonderful website that I highly recommend, the Census of Modern Greek Literature, which is an online database with all the bibliography on modern Greek literature for English speakers. Chomenidis has also written scripts, by the way, for cinema, for television, and has a weekly column in the newspaper Ta Nea in Greece. Now, Elke Weesjes is adjunct associate professor of history at the City University of New York, and she specializes in the social history of radical movements in Europe and the US. She is a very valuable interlocutor in this discussion on communist upbringing, especially because she has done extensive research into the topic in the context of the Netherlands and Britain, looking at national differences within international communist movements. She is the author of Growing Up Communist in the Netherlands and Britain, but also in Dutch, Mamalas, Marx, communistische gezinnen na oorlogs Nederland. You see the cover here, and she will talk about it a little bit in a bit. Now, between our novelist, Christos Chomenidis, and our historian, Elke Weesjes, we have Michel, who is actually both of these things, historian by education, and also a novelist, and of course a journalist. So we thought he'd make a perfect moderator for this evening. Michel Krielaars is a journalist, editor of the literature section of the NRC newspaper. He studied history, but has also written a lot of history books, but also novels, a short story collection, and books about Russian history particularly. Some of his most recent books are Oorlog met Rusland from 2022 and De Klank van de Heilstaat, Muzici in de tijd van Stalin, on composers and musicians in Stalin's time. And on the PowerPoint, you also see the cover of another book by him, Alles voor het Moederland, on Stalinist terror in the time of the Russian Jewish authors Isaac Bal and Vasily Grossman. So through his work as a journalist and author, he has contributed to a better understanding of Russian culture and history in the Netherlands. The structure of the evening is this. Each of our speakers will now take the word to first talk for about 5 minutes each and introduce their work as it relates to these topics, this evening's topic, or share some initial thoughts about the topic. And then they will have a discussion about, a discussion with Christos Chomenidis and Elke Weesjes, moderated by Michel Krielaars. And of course, towards the end, there will be opportunity for you to ask questions. And afterwards, we'll have a small reception, during which you'll also have the opportunity to buy a copy of Niki, signed by the author himself, but also of Elke Weesjes' book, Mamela's Marks. Enjoy the evening. Christos, can I give you the floor?
Come there.
Yeah.
Okay. No. First of all, I cannot describe you how happy and how moved I am to be here amongst you. One thing is to start writing novels or stories as a very young person. I was born in 1966 in Athens. I decided to become a writer when I was 16 years old. And the first one who was informed was my grandmother, who was 92 then. And I told her, okay, I will not be a lawyer, I will not be an economist, I will not be a politician, I would be a writer, because this is the way to live many lives into one life through your heroes. And she answered to me, okay, become a writer. It's your choice. She wasn't against, she wasn't for. And this was a very good tip. It's your choice, your life. And I started, my first novel was written when I was 23 and was published when I was 26. And it became a big success in Greece. And thus I continue writing. Niki was my 10th, if I'm not wrong, my 10th novel. And till then, I had not used these biographies, the stories of my grandparents, because I found it. I didn't want to take advantage of the family stories for my works, so I was avoiding them in a way. Nevertheless, I was listening to them. I was brought up, I'm the only child of my family. I was amongst older people, I mean my parents, my grandparents, aunts that had lived, the uncles that had lived the Greek history of the 20th century. They were not only, this was emphasized by Maria Bolecci, they were not only left-wingers. They were people that belonged to the centrist, to the center, the political center, or even to the right wing. So I was listening as a child to the same stories from the perspective of the left, of the center, and of the right. There was not even one who was a Nazi, thank God, or a Nazi sympathizer. And there was not even one who didn't take part in history. And you know, the Greek history of the 20th century was full of passions and, turbulence and things that were dramatically changing the everyday life of the Greeks, of the people of Greece. I decided to start. This is what I want to say and finish for the time being. How did I start write Niki. It was 2012. I was 46 years old, and Niki, my daughter, who is there, reading her book, was 2 years old, and I had the idea, the idea fixed that I would die when I would be 48. Why? Because my father died when he was 48, and I don't know whether you know that, when you have lost a parent of the same sex in a relatively young age, it's very common to have the idea that you would die at her or on his age as well. And I was believing that I would die from the same cause, which was lung cancer. So I was talking with Niki's mother, and I was telling her, we're living in Corfu then, in the beautiful island of Corfu, and I was telling her one night that when I die, you have to, I will tell you all the stories of my family, because everybody had died before me. I mean, my mother died when Niki died when in 2008. And I was telling Niki's mother, Alexandra, that she had to listen to my stories of the family, to look at the pictures, in order to tell little Niki all these things, because I believe that our treasure, our ark, is the stories that we know, we have lived, we have listened to, and we need. It's very nice to tell them, to tell the stories to our children. And Alexandra, Niki's mother, tells me, as far as I know, you are not a plumber, you are not an engineer, you are a writer. So sit down and write these stories. And I started the same night, and I started the book as a letter for my daughter. And when I was in the 10th page, I realized that this is not a letter, this is a novel. And that's how I continued, and I wrote Niki with one breath, literally. Not one breath, it took me 1 year and a half. And Niki was written in cafes, it was written in Athens, downtown Athens, because I was smoking that time still, and I didn't want my young daughter, my small daughter, to breathe the smoke. So I started trying to write the story of a family, and I ended up to have written the story of a country, more or less. That's why it was so successful, I believe. And I'm grateful to you, I'm grateful to everybody that reads Niki. And I'm here to answer any question.
Niet de bril vergeten. Hello. Hi. My name is Elke Weesjes, as Maria just told you, and I'm a history professor at the University of New York. And first of all, I want to do the same. I just want to thank you all for coming. This is very exciting, and I also like to thank the organizers, of course, for inviting me to speak today as part of this panel. Very, very, very excited about it. I enjoyed reading Niki, and I saw immediately quite a few parallels between this novel and my oral history project about rank-and-file communist family life during the Cold War. Findings from this project, for which I conducted a series of interviews with 40 Dutch and British cradle communists, so people who grew up in communist families, formed the basis of my books, Growing Up Communist in the Netherlands and Britain, which compares, and this is an academic book, so it compares the Dutch and the British communist movements, and then also Mama Loves Marx, which is a non-fiction, which is based on the Dutch portion of my research. Mama Loves Marx was named one of the best books of the year in 2023 by the literary magazine The Dutch Review of Books, which of course made me very happy. And for those of you interested, you can buy it afterwards at a discounted price for €10. Bargain. So as a visiting research fellow at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, I conducted additional research that focused primarily on sexual health and working class activist involvements in the feminist, the anti-racist, and gay rights movement. Because of my research expertise, I was invited to join the editorial board of the British peer-reviewed journal 20th Century Communism. And coincidentally, I thought it was quite good actually, that the most recent issue I've edited is titled Imagining the 20th Century Resistance Fighter, Intersectional Perspectives on Global Anti-Fascist Movements and Commemorations. Quite a mouthful, I'm sorry about that. But it contains an article about the life of the Greek female resistance fighter and heroine of the left, Elektra Apostolou. I hope I say that correctly. So before we start today's discussion about Niki, I'd like to say a few things about my research project and how it kind of overlaps with Christos' novel. Historiographies of communism often focus on those who were at the vanguard of the movement and kind of overlooking the lived experiences of less prominent figures and individuals, and rarely delving into communists' home lives. So in my books, I take an alternative look at the movement using oral histories of cradle communists. And perhaps you are familiar with the American book by Lynn Shapiro and Judy Kaplan, Red Diaper Babies, which came out in the, I believe it was the late 90s, or the British book Children of the Revolution by Phil Cohen. So my research project, which I started in 2001, was inspired by these two works. And just that you know that I basically interviewed these individuals over time. So at a certain point, there was almost 20 years in between. And I thought it was very interesting, as someone who does oral history, how memories change over time, and also what the impact might be of a parent dying on the way that we remember, and the likelihood that we want to talk about perhaps the more negative aspects of an upbringing. So I was very interested in how these stories changed over time, because we all know that, you know, these stories do change. So furthermore, my decision to focus on the Netherlands and Britain in my first book was influenced by recent historiography on Western communist parties, including works by Kevin Morgan, who's also one of my fellow editors at the journal I work for, and Matthew Worley. The comparative approach is critical in the analysis of political movements because it allows us to determine if some issues are the result of specific national conditions or are indicative of larger international trends. As a result of this method, we can see how pervasive certain issues were throughout the wider communist movement, particularly those pertaining to the Cold War. And I have to say that before reading Niki, I didn't really know that much about the Greek communist movement. But some of the similarities are striking, and perhaps the differences between the Greek communist movement on the one hand and then the Dutch and British communist movements on the other are even more interesting. My books explore respondents' day-to-day lives at home, at school, at work, and in communist youth organizations, and a little bit in the party too, but that's not the main focus. And they challenge the notion that communists all lived in an ideological bubble, in an isolated island away from everyone else. Quite on the contrary, I argued that British and Dutch communists had a close yet extremely complex relationship with the non-communist or the bourgeois world. Analyzing the different types of communist family units, and this is also very important when we look at Niki. My work distinguishes between ordinary rank-and-file communists and the cadre and leadership whose lives were much more internal than most local communists, and also between the public and the private lives of communists. In public, communists may have looked very uniform in their views and interpretations, but their children revealed that in the privacy of their homes, communists expressed doubts and their actions regularly deviated from the official line. By allowing us an intimate look inside the communist home and into the movement as a whole, my respondents provide us with an alternative view of what growing up communist really was like. Likewise, within the privacy of the communist home, we find not only differences between the communist experience in Britain and in the Netherlands, but also many differences among communists based on other identity markers. Now, what do I mean by that? Rank-and-file communists were never just communists, though have been portrayed as such because they shared the same encompassing worldview. Instead, they were diverse and had different needs and priorities. And these needs and priorities also changed over a lifetime. Aside from being a communist, they were also members of a nation, a social class, a gender group, a family, a local community, and a racial or ethnic group in some cases. So their allegiances to these groups and social constructs varied, and especially in the context of their family and their children's upbringing, which is really quite the most private thing that you can think of, right? These allegiances were sometimes more powerful than their allegiance to the party and the Soviet Union. So that's kind of my work in a nutshell. It's really hard to kind of get it down in 5 minutes, but I look forward to exploring these themes further during our discussion. Thank you.
I'm just going to tell a few minutes about my own experiences with communism. At the end of the 80s, I visited Moscow for the first time in my life, and I was studying Russian history already for more than 10 years, and I was fascinated by the Soviet Union and Russian history all over for maybe since I was 12 years old boy. I came in a city of which I thought communism was everywhere. And since that time, actually, I never met a real communist in Russia or in the Soviet Union. The only ones were maybe party functionaries making their careers. A good example of them is Michel, who became an oligarch later on. And he was a member of the communist youth movement at the Institute for Chemistry named Mendeleev. And a Dutch friend of mine, who is now a diplomat in Armenia, he wanted to learn Russian, and he started to study at this Mendeleev Institute in Moscow. And he was the only foreigner in class. And suddenly this Mikhail Khodorkovsky pointed to him and said to the other students, "Don't become friends with that enemy of the people. He is a capitalist. He is a bourgeois. Remember, we all are communists." And in the whole hall, the audience, they weren't communists at all, because communism in the late Soviet Union already was an empty ideology. The system didn't work at all. Everybody was poor. And there was this famous saying, "We do as if we work, the Kremlin does as if it pays us." And that was more or less the only ideology left in the last few years of the Soviet Union. I told you about the hierarchy, and I've met Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev on the streets of Moscow. They were more or less believers. They were people thinking that they could reform the system. They were idealists who wanted to, really to have a communist society. And I was very glad reading in Niki that the Greeks actually, at last, the Greek communists, they really were believers. They really were people who wanted to impose that system on their country. And as I was told by a friend of mine who is sitting on the first row, actually the Greeks, those people, they didn't have a choice at the time. Because at the one side you had the fascists of Metaxas, and at the other side you had the Americans who wanted to have their influence in Greece at the time. So becoming communists after the Second World War was a clear choice. And in Holland, I knew only a few communists. They were Jewish, they were more or less sectarian people, and after Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956, they were cancelled by their non-communist friends and by society as a whole. And that is also part of which Christoph is talking about in his novel. It's the complete disillusion after hearing, for the communists in Greece, after hearing what crimes against humanity Stalin committed. And that was a moment, a very important moment for people to lose their belief in a better society. And that is what Christoph mentioned in his book. For me, it was also a history of Greece put into a novel. Because actually you should conclude that after the Second World War, it stopped in Holland, it went on in Greece. There was this huge change of people already. There was this civil war going on, people hating each other, communists trying to keep secret. And Christos' grandfather, he was in parliament in the 30s as a communist. It showed that it still was an acceptable political movement. And in theory, of course, it's something very human. But as we know, already at the end of the 20s in Russia, Stalin started to kill all the real communist believers. And actually, the whole party elite was disappeared in the 30s, and again after the Second World War, a new purge started and the old believers were all murdered. And that must have been of great influence to many other communists in the Western world. And that's the thing we're going to talk about the next 45 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. I'd like to start with you, because you're the writer in residence. I've got to off this thing. What was, you told already why you wrote Niki.
Which was my motivation.
What was your motivation to only to focus on this communist past of your relatives?
Because it was there, first of all. I mean, I was my beloved father, my beloved grandfather, my beloved grandmother. They had spent their entire lives being communists. Or the brother of my other grandmother was a prolific figure of the Communist Party, of the Communist ideology. His name was Dimitris Glinos. The Greeks amongst us know him, and he was a pedagogue. He started from being rather right wing, and as the years passed, he was moving to the left, and he ended his life as the emblematic philosopher of the Greek communism. And and the other, my paternal grandfather was the one. He was socialist, and he was one of the four people that started the EAM, who was the National Liberation Organization in Greece, of course left wing, and he was executed by the Germans in 1944, and he became the hero of the family. I never met him, but I have his name. So I knew very well how these people were, and I loved them. Nevertheless, I was never a member of a party or a communist youth organization. My parents were the people, the children that paid the marbles, we say in Greek, that paid for this. I mean, my mother, when she was 70 days old, was literally arrested together with her mother and was sent to many islands. I mean, these nice picturesque islands in Cyclades then were exile places for communists and for the people that were stealing animals in the Greek villages, and for people that were drug addicts and rembetes, folk musicians. So then she was when the occupation started, my grandma went to join the armies, the army of the guerrilla army, let's say. Yes, the partisans, that's the right word, yes. And she left my mother with her grandma, who was, and that's another aspect of the book. You see, and you probably saw it in the book, that the family is there. I mean, the bonds between the brothers and sisters in Greece were very strong, and they would never murder one another because of political reasons. And the head of the family was the grandmother, who was prolific and who was trying to put them all, I mean, to keep them all around her. She was the goddess.
Did they consider themselves a sectarian group in Greek society?
Communists, of course. The communists, of course, were believing that they had seen the absolute light, that their vision about life was the only right vision. And of course, there were, this culture it had to do with the poets, the musicians, the artists who were leftists in Greece. And, this thing, after the defeat in the Civil War, grew even more, it grew stronger. I mean, they say in Greece, and it's a bit, it's in a way it's true, that the left lost the Civil War, but won this privilege, this moral privilege, and the songs, the books. In a way, Niki is a revisionist book. After all these years. The last thing that I have to say is that when I was a little child, a little boy, in the family, all together, the question that was it was put again and again in every family dinner was why we lost the Civil War. And of course the answer is obvious, that this Civil War was needed, that the left were they were parasirtkan, Maria? They were carried away to be in this struggle, and that there was no chance for them to go to the victory, to win. Of course, there is another theory that Stalin wanted Greece to be in this civil war because it helped him and Soviet Union to have this in Balkans, this open wound.
Because Stalin, of course, wanted to have the Greeks and the Turks in his camp, more or less.
After Yalta, he knew that Greece is in the Western world, but he wanted Greece to be, you know, a problem for the British and then for the Americans.
Elke, you're specialized in this communist sectarianism. What did you recognize in the novel Niki?
Well, we wouldn't call it sectarianism. I don't think that that's a term that people would use when they are, you know, in the communist movement. But yeah, so there were definitely some parallels that I thought were interesting. So first of all, I really noticed just how strong the Catholic tradition and how much influence that had on. So there's, you know, on the one hand, we have a Calvinist tradition in our country. That doesn't mean that you are actually a Calvinist, but we're very much influenced by Calvinist values. And they happen to be really quite similar to communist values, right? So with the Catholic Church, I saw the same thing in Britain when I interviewed people who were minors, who came from Catholic families, and they actually had, so especially when we look at gender and sexuality, they were extremely, well, they were very conservative. So that was one of the things that I noticed, the way that they were raising Niki. There were so many rules, whereas both in Britain and in the Netherlands, it was very clear that, you know, children were raised, which is quite revolutionary at the time. This is in the 50s, in the early 60s, they were raised as equals. And it was all about, you know, it's like there was so much trust in the children and the way that they were being spoken to. There was a lot of equality, which I thought was very interesting. But which
was in the non-communist families.
This was in the communist families, yes. And
it wasn't happening in the non-communist.
No, because at the time, in the 1950s, there was still a hierarchy within the family. So a father would be head of the family, then there would be the mother, and then the children. And that hierarchy only started to kind of disappear in the late 50s when pedagogues were like, well, you know what, this is not really working. So then they started to come, you know, a few of the, like, you know, your Dr. Spock comes out and people start to...
But Dr. Spock is not approved by the communists.
Well, they had their own. So they had their own. They had Makarenko. So they had Anton Makarenko, who wrote.
And Dr. Spock, because I was a Dr. Spock child.
Yeah.
I mean, this was the book that my mother and my father were reading all the time.
Yeah.
But it wasn't approved by the.
No, because they had their own. They had their own pedagogue, and actually, but you know, when you put both of the works next to each other, there is more similarity than there's any difference.
I don't believe. I don't want to interrupt you. Can I say? But can I say one thing? We have to have in mind that Greece was a very poor country, very poor country. That the leftists were right because when most of the population doesn't have. The children in Greece before the war, they didn't even have shoes to wear. Mm-hmm. And there is a very macabre little story, that the King George II and a friend of him traveled around Peloponnese, and they were betting how many children they would see that they were wearing shoes. They were barefoot. The children. So the idea that we have to change the society was very right. Who could tolerate this social injustice? Mm-hmm. And the thing that you become communist and you read Leninism or even the writings of Stalin, and they say, Stalin is the great leader of the humanity, is something different. Different than the first motivation, the ideal, the romantic approach of the people in Greece, that they were feeling the obligation to go with the guys who were right, and these guys were leftists then in Greece.
But at the same time, you saw all over Europe after the First World War, Italy, for instance, Germany, they also were very poor, the countries, after this war. The whole infrastructure was destroyed, the economy didn't function again. There were revolutions, even in Holland, in this...
and another thing, in Greece, we didn't have social democracy. Yeah. We never had social democracy. We had the liberals with Eleftherios Venizelos, but Eleftherios Venizelos vote for a law. The name in Greek is the ideonymon, which said that if you were just a believer of the communism, you can be sentenced into prison.
Yeah, but so that considering the background that you are now providing, yeah. I think it's really interesting when you look at values, going back to your question, what was different. So one of the things that stood out, for example, is that the way that there was a disdain, it was kind of like how Niki's father, Antonis, was looking down on the working class in a way I've never seen in any of my interviews. For example, that he hates the fact that she gets a waitressing job because he thinks she's too good for that. Then he also gets a job. He's so worried that he would follow his own father sweeping the floor because he said, nothing worse can happen to me than having that job. Communists...
No, he doesn't say this thing. He says that, okay, when he's outcasted from the Communist Party and he needs to find a job.
Yeah.
What he says is that, okay, I would do any job that is offered to me in order to have a bread for my family. He doesn't say that I'm snobbish to a job or another job.
Antonis says that he doesn't want to be his father and that he does not want to have that job.
He doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be disappointed or to have the idea of failure.
Yeah, because he associates that job with failure. And I thought that was interesting because there's just the way of the interpretations of the communist ideology. On the one hand, they're super strict. Like, they're very ideological. And especially Anna is very, very ideological. She's very, quite rigid in the way that she thinks, right? And then on the other, you have the father somewhere in between, because there's definitely kind of like there's moments of doubt. I could see more in, and of course being expelled from the party is not a nice thing. So maybe that opened up some space in his mind to kind of start discussing things within himself, right? But I was just really surprised about that he was still looking at society in these kind of hierarchies and seeing something as a failure.
That he feels an elite, that he belongs to an elite.
Well, just perhaps a different kind of interpretation. It's like, so because what is it exactly? Because I remember reading the passage about being the street sweeper and how he doesn't want to end up like that. So one of the things that I realized when I interviewed the 40 people that I interviewed over 20 years is that they were part of the working class, but there was a moral superiority. So on the one hand, so this is a kind of like a clashing idea, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we see that people want to be representatives of the working class, but then on the other, they feel that they have to educate the working class, which then puts them above them. And in reality, they were, as you could also see with Niki's education, when it came to culture, the way that she was, an extremely cultured person, right? Her homeschooling was very broad and very intensive. She was she was an intellectual. Her father was an intellectual. I mean, they were all very well read. So that automatically then puts people, already in that vanguard. And of course, so there is a clash there. It's like thinking that you want to be part of the class, but then you are slightly above it because you want to kind of lift people up and be a role model for the rest of the working class.
And is that a difference you've seen in Western European countries?
Well,
are they more working class?
Well, they were. Well, no. I mean, like in the Netherlands is a funny one because we have a very intellectual kind of like foundation, So no, I think that after the Second World War, the Communist Party in the Netherlands was a very working class party, and of course, like in the 60s, it opened up again. But so it fluctuated. But it was after the Second World War for quite a long time a working class based party.
What I mentioned in Niki is that Niki's father is extremely. What he reads and makes him saying that I will become a communist is this idea of the new man, human being in socialism. This idea that is written by Trotsky, I suppose, I think, that, okay, our vision as communists was not only to make a better society, but to create a new kind of human being. And this is very attractive.
It's how it started in the Soviet Union after the revolution.
That, comparing to the new man in socialism, the man in capitalism would seen as an ape, as a very primitive kind of life. Isn't this true?
It is.
And this is something that you can fall in love with. Not only to change dramatically the society and to make it better, but even to change the species.
And that's why he also went to the party school in Moscow.
Yes.
During the times of the Great Purges, a few years before.
He was telling me, the real person, that he was there in Moscow. He had met Dimitrov. He had met, what's the name, Passionaria. He danced with Passionaria once, Vals, and he even met Stalin for a brief, for 3 minutes, because Stalin, in 1st of May of 1933, I suppose, he made a big reception for the people from abroad, from the International, and he was shaking hands with everybody. But then afterwards, my grandfather understood the meaning of many things that he had seen, and he asked, and the answers were not very convincing by the Soviets. For example, that the metro, how do we call it? The metro in Moscow was built from the people, by the people in prison, and they used them as slaves.
And it was organized by a Dutch engineer called Schermerhorn,
really?
Who disappeared in the purges.
Okay.
Yeah. But do you recognize something Elke says about, for instance, Dutch communism being very much influenced by the Calvinist mentality?
Yes.
And can you say the same thing in Greece?
It's the same thing in Greece, yes, of course. I believe that both in Greece and in Soviet Union, in Russia, let's say, we can see communism as a heresis of the Orthodox Christianity. I mean, even the symbols, even this idea, the semiology. Let's say we have the sacred books, which is the capital of Marx, and or the holy books of Christianity. We have the prophets, and Marx, Engels,
and the red corner with the portraits of Stalin, Marx, Engels, Lenin.
Yes, it's like a church. Like church. We have this Lenin guy who is like Jesus Christ, and we have the martyrs, the saints, even John Reed. So it's very similar. It has many things common, no? And the biggest difference is that in a Christian faith, paradise is after death. In a communist faith, it would be after revolution.
Elke,
do you have the same opinion?
Yes, I can agree with that. Yeah. But Elke, I was mentioning the word sectarian, and because immediately, as I told you during my short speech, that after 1956, it was more or less you should keep secretive that you were a communist. Better not talk about it. In the book, it's after the war that Niki, with her whole family, they were in hiding in this White Tower neighborhood. How has it formed their mentality? Because I imagine that you can get completely crazy about this way of life.
They had don't forget talking about the idea is that they would be arrested, so they found a small house in a neighborhood in Athens, and they changed the names and they changed a bit their appearance. And we talk about a period where there's no there are not so many photographs. There's no cinema, there's no television. Cinema there is, but there's no television. They don't recognize them. On the other hand, Niki's father has spent 3 years and a half alone in a cell in the prison. So he knows how to face this situation, and he believes so strongly deep in himself that he continues. He has no problem. And he believes that the history would give him right. The same thing that Fidel Castro said in his trial before the revolution in Cuba, that the history would give me the right that would say that I am right. Niki's mother as well. Niki herself really was suffering very much because she had to change her name in the age of 10 years old. When you are 10 years old and change your name is not to go to the school. Don't have, not to be, to build real friendships with the children of her age.
How did you find out during your research? Was it more or less the same?
This is a unique situation that Niki passed. And I believe that it has many common things to Anna Frank's faith. When my American publisher asked me to find a phrase about Niki, I answered her, the phrase is Anna Frank falls in love. Because Niki has many similarities to Anna Frank, but she survives this situation and then falls in love and rebels herself, she rebels against her revolutionary parents. And this is the great moment of the book, in my opinion.
In Holland, the communists played a very important role in the resistance against the German occupiers. They were heroes after the war, and then it was Budapest, 1956.
Well, it wasn't 1956, it was 1948, where the Cold War started almost immediately after. There was really only, maybe a year and a half where the Communist Party was enjoying a lot of popularity with a massive amount of Waarheid readers and party members, and there was a sense of people understood how much loss, how much there was sacrificed, and communists were also in hiding for quite some time. So this whole aspect, and then of course in 1956, a lot of the party leaders' families and more prominent communists had to go into hiding again. So when you talk about any type of trauma and how you cannot even overcome that trauma because you're not even allowed to speak about it anymore because you just went from a hero degraded to a villain within a few years. Maybe an adult could understand that, but the children of these people had a much harder time. And then to go back into hiding, that would exacerbate that type of trauma that people were feeling if they had to go back into hiding. We can only imagine what that felt like for people who had been in hiding, who had been in concentration camps during the Second World War, to then go in hiding again. And this is all kind of trauma that was never processed. So, I think that, of course, that has. But you know what? It did not actually mean that they left. It brought them, in many ways, it brought them closer because it was a continuation of the Second World War. It's like the enemy was once again, it was like a fascist enemy. They were once again the victim.
So they were united.
They were united. Well, they were, and this is something that I going back to what are the similarities. So there was a schism within the Communist Party in the Netherlands, and it was in the 1950s. So the Bruggroep was a group of people, and this is too difficult to explain everything here now, but what's important is that during a time of anti-communism, and don't get me, like, this was like McCarthyism over here. It's like people were like physically assaulted. Buildings were being attacked, because of everything that was happening. This type of violence, you don't really see it in that many other European countries. I'm not saying it's unique, but it definitely was something that was, pretty hardcore in the Netherlands. So, so what happened is that then during this time of anti-communism, the Bruggroep, which was an even smaller group of communists, were not really welcome anymore in communist homes, but they were still considered communists. So this is a little similar to what happened with Niki, because she had to deal with, they were not part of the Communist Party anymore. Father was expelled, but he was still a believer. So where does that leave her? In what situation does that leave her? So I think it got very confusing.
There was a witch hunting in the Communist Party all the time, from the 30s till 74. I mean, they were always trying to find who the traitor was.
Yeah.
Who was the one who was the secret agent of the police.
But we have had the same in Holland in the 30s already. I mentioned Karel van het Reven family. His father was also thrown out of the party after the scandal because he was supposed not to be loyal to Moscow.
And there was another thing in Greece. During the Civil War and after the Civil War, the state, the government, the official government, was telling you, if you were a communism, that if you wanted to go to the university, or even to have a driving license, or even to have a license to hunt, if you were living in a village, you had to sign a piece of paper that was saying that you disgust communists and you have nothing to do with them. And this was the way to be baptized again in our national family, which was something very harsh and very bad, especially when the leadership of the Communist Party in Greece was telling them not to sign this paper. I mean, the clever thing to do, in my opinion, was to tell them, if you were the leader of the Communist Party in Greece, okay, everybody will sign it. And this would be a mocking. If everybody signs it, it loses its meaning. But no, you have to be in the island of the exile, you have to be in the prison, you have to be tortured and even die as a martyr in order to become a hero and be in this church of communism, which is, I mentioned this in Niki more than once, that they needed new heroes, fresh heroes, and they were driving people to die. This is something that it makes me crazy even now.
When was a communist again allowed to stand for parliament? In 55? Or?
No. They were out of law in 48. The last time that they were in power in the parliament was in the parliament of 1936. Then it was the dictatorship of Metaxas. And then after the war, they were saying that this EAM, I mean the Liberation Front, the National Liberation Front, which was a left organization, very popular. It had more than 2 million people as members. It wasn't exactly communist. I mean, even people that were liberals, from the party of Eleftherios Venizelos were in EAM, and they were saying that EAM, if it had taken part in the elections of 46, it would have more than 30%, which would make it EAM the first or the second political power in Greece. But the leader of the Communist Party of Greece, Nikos Zachariadis, started the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War officially started from the communists. I mean, he organized an attack in a small village, Litochoron, in the last day of March of 1946, and then Civil War started. And this was one of the lethal mistakes of the communists, unless we say that it was told by Stalin, because as I was mentioning before, Stalin needed an open ground in southern Balkans.
And they never had a chance to win this war because they didn't have weapons enough to fight against the regular army.
You know, this is my personal opinion. The Greek society was a society of small farmers that were, their small piece of land, or their cows, their sheep. It was their meaning of life. Or petit bourgeois. The petit bourgeois doesn't want to lose his small fortune to give it to the idea of communism. So I believe that, and I mentioned this in the novel, when Niki's father gives a speech and he was asked whether after Communist Party wins, do they have, the people ask if they have to give their land or their little shops. And he's clever enough, and he means it, that, okay, you don't have to give your small fortune away to be public. And another guy who is very loyal to the Stalinist party tells him, comrade, you are wrong. They'll give everything. Everything will be public. Will be the fortune of the state, of the social state. And but I strongly believe that Greek society is a petit bourgeois society. And it's a funny thing that, after in the 80s, PASOK, the party of Andreas Pandreou, is the petit bourgeoisie itself. That's why it became so popular.
Let's go back to Niki. Do you think she really received a typical communist upbringing?
No, I don't think so.
No.
Well, the thing is, what is a typical communist upbringing? One of the conclusions that I draw is that it is very, depending on. But what I see, so if I think about a communist upbringing and I look at the both countries that I studied and take what they have in common, I see a lot of the things, as I was saying before, when it comes to how strict she is, but also how kind of like disloyal she is to us, that she's like, and perhaps that's because she was raised, for quite some years by family members that weren't communist, and that she was also exposed to, more wealth and more standing, and she was having like a yearning for the nicer things in life. So that could be explained that way. But I think that, when it comes to like sexuality, I thought that her parents were incredibly prudish. And also even like in terms of gender, I thought that they were not particularly, they didn't, I think that had she been a boy, I think that the outcome would have been very different. I think that she would have been raised among, and that all of that, to me personally, that's not a communist upbringing, because I saw a lot of equality between the sexes in all the families. Brothers and sisters were raised the same way. It was the same expectation. Although I have to say that when it comes to education, it's like her father was very, he was very adamant that she should have a good education. So at least there was that. But I thought, what I saw, but also like how she absorbed things and how she stood in life and how eager she was to get away from it all. These are all things that I didn't recognize, because there was more loyalty. And perhaps, again, it's like she was in hiding, so she wasn't socialized by any communist youth organization. She was not part of a larger community where she could have felt at home. She was just completely separate and isolated from everyone, and only had her family to really look at, and they didn't necessarily share the same ideas. So I think that she did not have at all a communist upbringing. But I do think that we need to open it up, right, for the room, because otherwise we might not have enough time to hear from our audience. Shall we do that? Yeah.
Ja, dames en heren, nu mag u. Er is een losse microfoon en we hebben een lieftallige assistente. Dus steek maar een vinger op, u mag alles vragen. Er moet iemand zijn. Where is
Make a start.
mevrouw, daarachter?
Could you translate me the question?
It's a question for both of you. Do you think there's a difference in upbringing in a family where the Communist Party in that country is legal, while in Greece it was not legal for a long time to be a member of the Communist Party whatsoever? Do you think the stimulation of the state in that matter would have any influence in how a child or a person would be brought up within the communist frame?
Do you want to go first?
No.
No? Well, it's hard. You know, of course, the Dutch Communist Party wasn't always legal. It had to go underground, of course. It's hard to say because, you know, I think it was really difficult to be a communist parent at times. But at the same time, a lot of communist parents, as I said in my little introduction, they had very meaningful relationships with everyone in our... So just to give you some context, in order to be, you know, if you are always in the minority, which Dutch communists always were, right? So, and there's a lot of anti-communism, and you're very aware of that. People then wanted to just be normal and to blend in. And that was a really big thing for a lot of communists. They couldn't live in a self-sustained bubble. They had to be part of their community, their street. So they were the people that were extra active because they wanted to make sure that people didn't think they were. So they had to have these polished shoes. They had to have the clean shirts. They had to just hold up a certain standard because they felt so vulnerable for any attack coming from other people. And then what you then see is that non-communists, oh my God, I can't believe that you're a communist. It's like, you're such decent people. It's like, yeah, they are, you know, in a lot of ways. So, you know, I don't think, and that's not answering your question at all, but I'm not quite sure if you know, you can, like, such a small party that's being attacked left, right, and center. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say that they're angels. A lot of the, you know, they were in a political isolation, mostly because of their own, you know, for their own doing. Social isolation, however, I felt that was very unfair. I didn't feel that they deserved that at all, and especially not children, and the way that children were being treated in schools by teachers. You know, it was really quite horrific. And I think that, you know, obviously when these things happen to you, you kind of like search for comfort within your own community, right? So, and I think that that's why it was stronger. So in Britain, where they were fully, like in a lot of places in Britain, the Communist Party was so small that they had to, you know, they became a member of the Labour Party.
How small
instead.
was it in Britain? In
Great Britain? It's tiny. I mean, like tiny. We're talking about like a few. Like,
I mean, less than 1%?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like it was really tiny.
Mm-hmm.
But they did have quite a lot of, you know, organizations and so on, but not as much as in the Netherlands. Because in the Netherlands, and we haven't even discussed this yet, but we had pillarization. So, of course, there were these vertical pillars that made, you know, that people, even the social democrats, had a closed-off little society. So when you talk about these bubbles, there were bubbles in a way, you know, because when you're Catholic, it doesn't matter if you're a working man or, you know, an upper middle-class person, you would still go to the same places and be a member of the same, you know, you would read in the same newspaper. So any kind of like, there was not much kind of integration between these pillars. The communists didn't have a pillar, so they had to kind of fashion one, like an unofficial one. But they couldn't make use of any of the social democratic kind of organizations because for quite some time during the height of the Cold War, they closed their doors to communist, you know, members. And then, of course, in the 1960s, you see that there's some changes there. Interestingly, started sports organizations. Sport clubs are oftentimes the first ones where you see like people from different pillars in neighborhoods participating. So it was a strange, but there's so much context that I can't give you. But yeah, sorry, I'm taking too much time.
In the novel, it's all those beliefs are mixed up. Huh? The family, there are people collaborating with the Germans. There are people, relatives.
This is Greece.
Yeah,
I mean, we're all mixed up, and we change our mind very easily, and that's why we appreciate so much the people that don't change their mind. Mm-hmm. I mean. To talk a bit about the recent history of Greece, you know what Syriza was. You know the referendum that we had in the 2015. I meet, I live in Athens, and I meet people, and I'm very social with people, and I desire mostly to meet people that are different than me ideologically. The people that I meet that say out loud that they had voted for Syriza in 2015 are less and less. And not because now they say lies. They don't lie. They had forgotten. They don't want to remember. And they had changed their mind. And they say, me, did I vote for Syriza in 2015? No, I didn't. It's.
But is it the same with the communists?
No, the communists are very proud. They're very proud of themselves. And this is another thing that, to put it more in general, the ancient Greek religion was not a religion exactly. The gods were 12 gods and goddesses, 6 and 6, and everybody had his own ideas, and you could be with this god or with the other god. In the war on Trojan, half of the gods are with the Greeks and half are with the Trojans. And they even changed during the war. So this is the Greek way of thinking and feeling that I love, that I adore. To believe there is a great Greek writer, Stratis Tsirkas, who was a leftist, Stratis Tsirkas. And he has written a very, for me, moving thing, moving sentence, that I'd rather being killed for the love of a friend of mine than for an ideal, for a social vision. Because this is what counts at the end of the day. The relationship with people, with your friends, with your family, it might hurt to you a bit superficial. But in my idea, I'm 58 years old, and nowadays I believe, and as time passes, I believe it more strongly and more strongly, that what remains in life is the relationships, the love relationships with the people, and not the theories and the ideas. Sorry for being so superficial.
That's a good lesson. Other question?
Okay, I've read your book with pleasure, both from a political point of view and also from a human point of view. I've talked with Greek workers in the 70s and in the 80s, and when you see them as a waiter, well, you have normal contact, but when you talk with them when you are at home, you discover that they are communists. Yeah? And I wonder, what is the reception of your book in leftist circles and for Greek historians? What is that judgment about your book?
How has the book been received by in the left and by Greek historians?
Okay, the official Communist Party didn't like it, obviously. But I believe that too many people... I wasn't a very popular figure then, in 2015 or 2014 in Greece, because I was saying out loud that, okay, the state had bankrupted, and that we needed this memoranda to take the money of the Europeans to try to cure our problems. And, of course, we need more social justice. But the memoranda are necessary. Half of the people in Greece were believing, or they were, the political leaderships were telling them that we don't need the memoranda. We didn't have any problem. The memoranda came, the crisis came because of the memoranda, and not that the memoranda came because of the crisis, of the bankruptcy. So I wasn't very... they didn't like me very much. But the Niki became a success from the very first week. And that's something very, very... The writer feels very nice when his book is more popular than himself. I mean, I remember was one of the best critics I've ever heard. A teenager those years, 10 years ago, during the crisis, meets me. I didn't know him. He was a guy, a 70 years old guy. We met in the Monastiraki. If you are familiar with Athens, you know where Monastiraki is. He tells me, okay, I want to tell you something. You are a great malakas, but your book is a masterpiece. This is very nice for somebody to hear it. Because let's imagine the vice versa. You are a great guy, but your book is malakia.
I don't know if there are any remaining questions. We don't really have time. We have to.
No, we've
round
got to
up.
stop it in 4
maybe
minutes.
Some
a last question from the audience. Yeah.
There are two hands I see. Maybe consecutively you can share your remark and your question, and then have some final comments, very brief from the. Yeah.
About the isolation of the Dutch communists during the Cold War, we couldn't get a member of the NVV, the union,
Trade union,
until 1971. That long it went on. And I remember stories from children, from communists, being on school on the 1st of May, being tied up with a red ribbon on their chair, and other children walking around and telling them you are a traitor.
Was it in Amsterdam?
Yes.
In this, I even had a person burst out in tears, and she explained that people threw rocks at her after Hungary. So, it got really, there were people sitting in their homes having dinner, and people threw in the windows. Now, if you go to Dutch homes, we got oftentimes big old windows. Tables are oftentimes very close to those windows. So, and this kind of fear, this is November, so it was cold. So people remember that their father was actually there. He went to the party building to defend the party building, and mother was home with the children, and the home was being destroyed by angry mobs, So I think that when it comes to these types of things, it's people underestimate just how traumatic it was, and especially for the children, but for a lot of the members, Yeah.
Final question. Thank you very much. Interesting remark.
I have a personal question. You said Niki has suffered a lot. Can you say that she was traumatized, and if so, was it passed on to her son?
That's a big question.
You have been traumatized by the traumas of Niki, of your mother.
I don't believe that. Your mother can traumatize you much more. By other things, being a normal mother. My mother was she was a bit shy. Another motivation. This has some meaning. After all these 7 years in being with a false name in a house without going to school and all these things, and being afraid that they would take her parents and execute them. She was very shy. She didn't, when she was in a group of people talking, she seldom saying out loud her opinion, because when she was shy, she was even afraid of expressing herself. When she died, another motivation that I didn't understood, I didn't realize I realized it after I have completed the book, the novel, is that I needed her to talk about her life. And I needed her voice to be heard. And when I meet people that have read Niki, the novel, and liked it, I feel satisfied deep